Good evening, church. Well, there's a few more people here than I thought would be here. I thought maybe everybody would be, at home preparing their nachos and their chicken wings. I just read that for 30 seconds on CBS tonight. Do you know how much for your commercial you'd have to pay? $6.5 million. So you're going to have to watch those at some point tonight because they just have to be that good. But I know that it's obviously no surprise that we're looking for a more permanent pulpit minister. So those of us that stand up here, we're really have free reign to talk about whatever our heart desires, and that's kind of a scary thing. And I always think, what should I talk about? What kind of topic should I pick? But I think really what happens, and I don't know if some of the other gentlemen find this to be the case, but the topics that kind of find you, you're just living your life, and maybe you hear something or you read something, then you dig further into that, and then you're on to something else, and then that goes on, and then before you know it, you have something to say. So that would be my case, and I have a little something to say, and it all kind of started off with a memory that I have, and the memory is I'm about 7 years old, and I'm in school, so I'm in class. I don't know, maybe what is that, second grade or something, but I'm in class, and it must be like reading time, so I'm sitting in class, and all the boys and girls are sitting in their class at their desk, and I remember I've been reading a book, and I must have really been liking this book, because I'm into it, enjoying it. It must be getting towards the climax or something, because I was really into it. And what I remember was that it must have been reading time was over, and all the boys and girls were packing up their books to get on maybe to the next subject, but I didn't hear any of that, because I was reading this book, and I was totally focused on it. And the next thing I remember is that the teacher pats me on the shoulder, and I kind of come to, and she's like, "Yeah, reading time's over. Close your book." And all the other kids are howling in laughter at me, at that moment in time. And I remember that very clearly. And I guess probably the reason I remember it is because they were making fun of me. But the memory's very vivid. And I even remember the book I was reading. It was Ribsy. It was Beverly Cleary. Do you remember this? I actually just looked this up. It was published in 1964. But I remember I always enjoyed this series. And that was the book I was reading. And I've always wondered, why is it that my senses were hijacked at that moment? How come I couldn't hear my teacher talking to me, the other kids talking? I couldn't hear anything. I was so focused on this book that I couldn't hear a thing. And so I've always been sort of in the back of my mind over the years. And then, as I was reading the Bible, and I came across, this scripture that you guys know very, very well, Hebrews 4:12. For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword, penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. And so I've read that before and thought, okay, but this text that we read from is 2,000, 3,000 years old, so it's alive and active. And so anyway, I put that together with this memory of myself as a kid, and I thought, hey, well, maybe that's true. Maybe that's a lie. Maybe I should dig more into that. So my question was, how can words do that? How can words do that? Have you ever been enthralled in a book or a movie or a story? Really into it? A good story can do that to you. It can grip you. It grips you. It makes you invest yourself in the characters. You want to know their motivations, and you want to know what happens next. I've never really been much of a fiction guy. I've always been kind of a math and science guy. Certainly when I was going through all of my schooling and such, I was always taking tests in my head in a textbook. I never really had time for pleasure reading. I never did much of that. And in my opinion, I thought it was a waste of time too. I was like, well, that's fiction. That stuff's not true. It's not even worthy of my time, and I really paid no attention to it. And then I would say maybe 15 years ago or so, and I think this has to do with my maybe being a little bit discontented with modern day television and the television content. I just got, to heck with that. And I started picking up some of the old classics that that I kind of maybe didn't read so well in high school, or kind of what was it, Cliff Notes? So I picked up things like Great Expectations, and picked up Crime and Punishment, and Great Gatsby, and a whole Brothers Karamazov, and all these other. I picked all those back up and I reread them, and after having read a whole bunch of those as the years have gone by, I've decided that maybe fiction's not so bad. Maybe Maybe fiction isn't false like I thought it was. But that's of course true. I mean, our culture is based on our stories. Culture is based on our stories. I mean, look back at the old ancient texts. I mean, human beings have been putting print down on paper for like over 3,000 years, okay? And so Homer in 800 BC wrote Iliad, which is basically like a war cry in the form of a poem. And maybe you've read some of Sophocles' plays or Aesop's fables, like The Tortoise and the Hare. Like there's ancient wisdom in these things. Dante's Divine Comedy, Canterbury Tales, Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, Don Quixote. These are old texts, and they're not to be ignored because they really are the basis for a lot of the stories that we see and hear today are based on those. And the Bible's really no different, except that the Bible's really, really special, and we're going to come back and talk about that. But the stories are important. You know, when I read the Bible and I think about all of these really old stories, they're like paramount to proper living. And maybe each one of these, when you think of these stories, they mean something different to you. Like, what do they teach you? Like when Adam and Eve, it's like, I have little phrases in my head for each one of these stories. It's like Adam and Eve. It's like you can have your free will, but now you get to be vulnerable. Or Cain and Abel. It's like, yeah, give a proper sacrifice. Don't be envious. Don't be murderous. Don't be resentful. I think of Noah. It's like, man, ally yourself with God. Bad times are going to come. Be on the ship with him. I think of Job. It's like, man, figure out how to have the right relationship with God when you're suffering like crazy. Abraham. I like this one. Be bold. Go out. Be courageous. Live a big life. It's going to be hard, but it's going to be worthwhile. Jacob. Work hard. Learn how to contend with God. And of course, all the stories that go along with Jesus. These are important stories, and they're fundamental stories. And you can sit and you can say, well, people like to argue about whether these things really happened or not. Are they true? It's like, are you kidding me? Are they true? Well, they're not true. They're more than true. They're hyper true. They're meta true. They're not true like other things are true. Like I could tell you that after church today, my family and I went to the restaurant and I had a hamburger, and that would be true, but like, who cares, right? These are meta-true. They're bigger than that. So I started to think, well, what is it about the history of literature that I need to know? So I went back and I read this book called Wonderworks by Angus Fletcher. It's actually a fairly recent book, and it's the 25 most powerful inventions in the history of literature. It was kind of a long book. It was okay. But I learned a couple things about it. One is this guy says that literature is the most important tool that humankind has ever made. Probably make that argument. That we're made to listen to stories. We're built for them. We're designed that way. And we're going to get to that. And that stories make us better humans. That when you listen to stories, you put this cloak on of this person that you don't know that has these situations and experiences that you don't understand, and all of a sudden now, by doing that, you've embodied their character. And now you're more empathetic, you're kinder, you're more generous, you're more effective, you're more useful, you're better. So it's good to read. It's good to know these stories. And so my next question was, what is it exactly that stories do to us? Like, what should I know about that? And so then I had to kind of put my lab coat on and start reading about that and figuring out what is it that actually does up here when you listen to stories. I mean, you guys know this if you have been in a good movie or you've read a good book. It's like you start squirming in your chair, or you palms sweat. Maybe your heart rate goes up a little bit. It's an exciting part of the movie, maybe something like that. You really get into it. You really embody the characters. And you say, well, I identify with the characters. Yeah, you identify with the characters. Well, here's what I mean by identify with characters. Now, if I was to ask every single one of you, I was going to tell you, I want you in the next 3 seconds to get out of your chair and jump up and down. Well, right now, every single one of your brains is activating this jump circuit. Okay, like this. So there's a plan. There's a program in your brain for jump. You've been working on this since you were a toddler. You know how to do this. You perfected it. So there's parts of your brain that are lighting up like crazy now when I start talking about jumping. In fact, if I put you in a functional MRI machine where it looks at blood flow, certain parts of the brain, and I tell you a story and I talk to you about jumping, that part of your brain will be lighting up like crazy. And you're not actually doing it, you're just thinking about it. In fact, if I told you a story with all different kinds of things, your brain would be lighting up like Christmas. And this has been done time and time again. This is true. So we just tell you a story, your brain is all over the place. Even though you're not actually doing it, just listening. So you really do embody the characters. In fact, brain activity of the listener mirrors the storyteller. So if I take two people and put them in the functional MRI machine, one guy's telling the story and the other guy's listening to the story, their brains mirror each other. So of course, the listener's about a couple seconds behind. But their brains mirror each other. You're in sync with the storyteller. Not only that, you get a little bit of shot of a boost of oxytocin, which is called the bonding hormone. So you get a little bit more empathetic, compassionate, kind, just by hearing stories. Isn't that cool? So now, if I take you back and I say, well, let's think about the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and I ask you, well, first of all, why don't you put yourself in the place of Mary? Okay, so this is her son that she's raised since an infant. Oh, remember that time? He got lost in the temple. This is her real son, you know? And now she gets to watch him be taken away by Roman guards, flogged and crucified. You got to think about how she would feel. Or maybe you put yourself in Peter's situation. You can put yourself anywhere you want in this story. And now you've just betrayed your friend to save your own hide. You ever lied to save your own hide? Maybe you can put yourself, maybe you can't, but you think about that. You embody that character. Maybe now you're Judas. Now you've committed a real atrocity of evil, something really evil. Now you're one of the people down on the ground scorning Jesus and spitting on him. Put yourself in their position. Maybe you're one of the bandits on either side that deserved it. Put yourself in that position. Finally, put yourself in Jesus' position. Now you're hanging on the cross. I always think about that. I can't get my head wrapped around having that through your median nerve, which is right there in the middle of your palm, how painful that would be. I can't get beyond it. I think about this stuff all the time. Right now, your brains are lighting up, and they should be, right? That's exactly what you want. And that's why the story is so powerful, because the Bible has really explicit ways of demonstrating truth in the proper ways of action. I mean, here's the 10 Commandments. Certainly, we can get some value out of those. But the Bible is much more sophisticated than that. It doesn't just tell you not to kill. Then it tells you the story of Cain and Abel. And this story is so amazing to me because, first of all, it's not very long. It's a pretty short story. I actually was trying to count the words. It's something like 300 words. And it is so packed, dense with meaning. I always think about when I was in school and my teacher would be, your English teacher would tell you, you get your grade back, and it's like, well, you need to elaborate more, and you need to use flowery language, and you need to, make it longer, all of that, right? Go back and read this text, man. That's not what this guy was worried about. This is so compact and dense with meaning. We're not computers. We're not artificial intelligence. We're not logic machines. That everything that you do, every decision that you make is in this framework of your goals. So maybe you've got short-term goals, and maybe you've got medium-term goals, long-term goals, maybe you've got eternal goals. Every decision you make is really kind of like nested in that framework of your goals. And I have a 16-year-old son, and he's a junior. And so he's really thinking a lot about college these days. And I can just see it in his eyes, his head spinning, He's always thinking about I got to study for this particular test, or I got my SAT coming up, or what do I want to go somewhere far away or close, or what kind of school can I get into? It's just, I can see it. It's on his mind all the time. That's his goal. And I can just tell all his decisions are based on getting to that goal. So it's why it's so impossible to predict human behavior. Like, I can't tell what any one of you guys is going to do in the next hour because you have such a constellation of goals that I could never possibly understand. You're more complicated than anything I could ever understand. We think in terms of plots of stories. We're not machines. That's what makes us so darn different. Now, there's this little organ in the middle of your brain called the amygdala Very important for emotions, sort of what houses the emotions. And it turns out that when you make a decision, that the starting point for that decision is in the amygdala, and then it shoots out from there. So that's really interesting. That means that's the basis for every decision that you make. So let's say you're hungry. Well, let me guess. Guess what? Your decisions are going to be based on that. If you're fearful, then your decisions are going to be based on that. If you're anxious, then your decisions will be based on that. If you're enthusiastic, then your decisions will be based on that. That's why we're so hard to predict. You are the most complicated thing that's ever existed, other than the person sitting next to you. I've heard that before. I wonder if that's true. The most complicated thing that's ever existed. Like more complicated than the universe? That's a big question, right? Well, look at these two pictures. One of these pictures is just a cluster of galaxies. With a cluster of galaxies with basically dark matter connecting each one of them. The other one is a neuron in your brain with all the synaptic connections. They look pretty similar, don't they? Turns out the neuron is the one on the left and the galaxies are the one on the right. But turns out that in your brain you've got about 80 billion neurons. And they're all connected to each other in a certain way. And they estimate that that's somewhere around 100 trillion synaptic connections. Well, in the observable universe, there's 100 billion galaxies and then 100 trillion or so connections between the two. So I don't know, you tell me, which one's more complicated? You or it? I'm not so sure. So in the 1950s, there was a neuroanatomist. Consequently enough, his name was Dr. Russell Brain, but listen to this quote. Even when the cold eye of science is exposed, every secret of the brain, the mind will remain explicable only by poetry. That is so cool. And by the way, I don't know that we'll ever know anything about the brain. We certainly have no idea why we're conscious, and we don't even know why we sleep. No clue. So it's not like we have any idea about exactly how complicated we even are. So back to the Bible is literature. It's got many, many different genres. Poetry, drama, biography, history, law, but all of it is contained or nested within this narrative, this big narrative. God created us, we fell away from him, and then he redeemed us. All these different genres are mixed into that one basic narrative, and I think that's so neat. And like I said, the stories of the Bible, to me, they seem hyper-true. And like I said before, you could argue about whether they really happened or not, and I think they really happened. But if that's your argument, if that's your level of analysis, then you don't even understand how true they really are. Because they apply to everybody all the time. And they're profound. That means they apply to everybody and they implore you to act. Try writing a story like Cain and Abel in 300 words. Try that. They're amazing. So then that begs the idea of, well, if they're narratively true, because they apply to everybody and they implore us to act, and they're historically true, which I believe them to be, and so do you, then that means they meet in the middle and they exist in a place that no other book really does. And that is a miracle. And that's why all of you are sitting here, is because the narrative and the historical meet. So sometimes I think about, what about the beauty of the Bible? Well, this is Psalm 119, and maybe you guys know Psalm 119 as being the longest psalm. And maybe when you're reading it, every year you're like, man, this is a long one. And it's kind of like a love poem to the law. But the cool thing is that it's called an acrostic poem. The first verse, every verse in the first stanza begins with the same Hebrew letter. And then the next stanza, it's the next letter in the alphabet. And the next stanza, it's the next letter in the alphabet. This is beautiful. Someone spent a lot of time putting this together. It's a beautiful poem, and it's a love poem to the law. So that's just some of the beauty you can find in the Bible. Now, I always think about the brilliance of the Bible, and constantly when I'm reading it, I'm coming up with things, and I'm like, man, that's brilliant. So I always think about, in Genesis 1, God said that let there be light. So he spoke it into being. He said, let there be light. And then it was so. Then he saw that it was good. And then repeat, right? Now, at first, when you're reading this, sometimes you read this and you're like, okay, why does he keep saying that? Yeah, I get it. Okay, repeat. It's like, no, you don't get it. Speak the truth into being. This is the direction for you. Speak the truth into being. Then see that it's good, and then do it again. I didn't really get that until I was reading Romans 12, 1, 2. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So man, that's it. Speak the truth into being. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. See that it's good. That's test and approve. And then the renewing of your mind. Repeat it. So the repetition's there on purpose. So when you crack open the Bible, you look for the beauty. Look for the brilliance. Look for the repetition, the cliffhangers, and the plot twists. I keep thinking, if you were reading the Bible for the first time and you saw, wait, so they killed him and then 3 days later he rose from the grave? Like, that's a plot twist, right? You wouldn't have seen that coming. And see how the small stories fit into the big picture. Sometimes, when I'm reading the Bible, I try to think to myself, like, big picture, what can I make out of things? And sometimes I think to myself, in the beginning, like in the beginning of the Bible, there's all this attempt to abstract God. Okay, so he created the world, but we don't really understand exactly, we can't see him, we don't know he's very powerful, he's just, he's honest, loving, but also sometimes harsh. But then, so we kind of get this picture of God, and then we get to the New Testament, and then there's we flip to the completely other side. We attempt to particularize God as a young, kind of poor carpenter from the back country, and that's somebody that we can kind of a little bit more, we can feel that plot line, right? We can imagine that a little bit more clearly. We feel that plot line. We can imitate that. And the rest of the Bible's trying to articulate that even better. So it's this whole idea that when we try to imitate things before we can articulate them. I mean, you know this if you ever watch little kids. Like, say you watch little kids are playing like Foursquare or something like that, and they're just playing away. Now, if you were to take one of those kids away and try to ask them about the rules, they probably would fumble through that a little bit. Yeah, but they can imitate it just like crazy. Same thing with like maybe kids playing house. They know how to play house, but ask them the rules. They don't really know. And so that's us a little bit. And so sometimes we read these stories and we can imitate them. And then maybe as we imitate them more and more, we can start to articulate them, and then we can start to explain them to others. The Bible's a book about history, time, places, kings, and kingdoms, no doubt. And it's historical and historically accurate in its ability to do that. But it's also a book about profound truths that apply to everybody all the time. But that's that mixture. It's that mixture between historical and divine that makes it special. It makes it different than those other fundamental books that I mentioned earlier. So what's your story? You live inside your own story. You have your own goals. You have short-term goals. You have medium-term goals. You have eternal goals. Interesting thing about that is that, when you have a goal and you make forward progress towards that goal, then you get a nice little puff of positive emotion, like joy. Maybe you call it happiness. And I actually think that's a good way of thinking about happiness. It's not an end goal. It's a byproduct of getting towards your real goal. Now, what happens when you get pulled away from your goal and you get thrown into chaos? Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe something that happened that was random and unfair. When that happens, I think you got to get back on track. And I think the Bible is the most sophisticated method for trying to reset your plot. The stories are all there. You just see them for what they are. Follow the stories. Imitate the stories, and then articulate the stories. Ladies and gentlemen, I just thank you so much for coming here tonight. And I hope that when next time you crack open the Bible, you can see it for all of these things. It is a piece of literature. It is an incredible piece of literature. But more than just being narratively true, it's historically true, and that's why it's special. And that's why all of you are here. Thank you so much. Let us stand and sing.